Good afternoon, and I wish I could be there, sort of. I had a presentation yesterday, and I will tell you this, that I'm taking care of a family member who isn't recovering from a surgery, an urgent surgery, as well as we had thought. So I'm sorry I'm not there in person. We're going to try to make this session as interactive as possible with Emily's help. But the reason why I might have lucked out is if you're like the folks that probably attended Ben-Seng Wang's presentation, you have some leftover tomatoes. And I am lucky that I'm in the Midwest, so you will have to hold on to those tomatoes for another presenter. Today we're going to talk about pump maintenance and some advanced maintenance strategies for infusion pumps. I want to take a quick poll of the group just by a raising of the hands. Emily will kind of count it, tally it up, or give me a percentage. How many people in the room are here and identify as somebody who works on medical equipment?
Oh, you've got everybody.
Okay, well, good, because this really is geared towards you. I just want to make sure that if there were other audience members that wanted to discuss other things, we certainly could do that, time allowing, of course. So I know you can see my slide, or I hope you can see my slide. And I wanted to share with you that this is not hopefully going to be one of those dry infusion pump overviews. I've added a little bit of the humor that I am inspired by. One of the areas, and that's Monty Python's Holy Grail. I'm going to liken those biomeds and those medical technology or medical equipment technology or whatever you call yourself, right? I'm going to liken you to wizards and, of course, the infamous knights. But what I'm not going to talk about is the pitfalls necessarily that you might see in Monty Python. There's some classic issues when if you are familiar with the movie, The Holy Grail, there's some classic fun that they make of the knights. A little bit of background about me before we get started. I have, up until joining ECRI, worked on infusion pumps throughout most of my career. I am not one that has shied away from working on infusion pumps and trying to improve upon myself. And so I'm glad that you're here. I'm not asking about how long you all have been doing what you do, but I will tell you, infusion pumps are critical in a hospital. They may not be critical as far as the high risk, but they are. And as you can see, I joined ECRI recently. They are typically one of the top 10 hazards that ECRI has identified in the healthcare setting, at least from a technology standpoint. And I pulled this estimate for the group here that 85 to 90% of all patients who stay in a hospital setting for at least 4 hours are estimated to be placed on an infusion pump. So that takes into account, just so you can kind of do the math with me, that takes into account those shorter term stays, hopefully your emergency room visit, if you have one or you know somebody that's been in the emergency room, that would probably eliminate that. Hopefully it's been shorter than 4 hours that you were in the emergency room. It doesn't always happen. I'm a testament to that. I've been in the emergency room longer. But I will share with you that the reason it's important is because this technology touches more patients than almost any other technology I can think of. I did not pull numbers on vital signs or patient monitoring, but I would bet it would give infusion pumps a run for the money, because usually you get your blood pressure checked at least when you come in for any sort of visit. And there you go. So our quest begins. What we're going to cover. We are going to cover some knowledge collaboration. We're going to dive into advanced maintenance strategies, troubleshoot the most common and complex issues, and explore preventative maintenance techniques to keep your pumps running smoothly. And you already heard about the kind of the why. But even though we're virtual, we'll make this interactive by sharing insights and best practices with each other. Hopefully, again, virtual has its obstacles, but Emily is going to help me on this. So one thing I would like to ask you all is if you have something to add or question or scrutinize for that matter, please get Emily's attention. Emily will then in turn turn on the mic. There might be a little bit of a pause. I might continue talking and then she's going to bring it back to your question or your concern about my tips for you. So we're going to talk about advanced maintenance strategies. Oh, Emily, yes?
Hey, I was just telling them if they raise their hand, I can go over with the mic.
Okay, great. I thought we already had somebody scrutinizing it that didn't like my AI generated image, but anyway. And this is a disclaimer. Most of the images, I think in this presentation, all of the images in this presentation, other than the templatized images that MD Publishing has provided, are AI generated. So if you see weird text, that's why. If you see a device you've never seen, it's good because I don't want to infringe on somebody else's copyright. Does that make sense? Plus, it also helped me get some pretty neat images. In this case, you can see there's one that typically you would not see a knight standing next to an HTM professional. So we're going to talk about advanced maintenance strategies. We're going to talk about, oh, it's telling me my microphone's too loud. Are you guys okay with my volume or should I kind of tone it down?
It sounds good.
Sounds good? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk about advanced, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just agreeing that the volume's okay.
Okay. Advanced maintenance strategies, some troubleshooting techniques, some key insights into preventative maintenance, avoiding the breakdowns before they happen. And we're going to do a little bit of interactive knowledge sharing, kind of leveraging your experience and maybe adding to a later discussion about best practices. So I like to think of the foundations first before we go into advanced. This is kind of like akin to your armor, right? How you're protecting yourself and your patients, right? Your institution. Regular calibrations are, let's say, akin to the night shield. Software and firmware updates. We need to talk about that, folks. And I know it's not always on our radar, but software and firmware updates are your sword to slay bugs. Battery health checks. It's the lifeblood. If those batteries don't work, and we know that it's not always plugged in, your pumps start to alarm and eventually fail. And preventative maintenance, of course, it's kind of like this overall armor protecting you and your devices. By treating maintenance as armor, you can prevent future breakdowns, you can ensure patient safety, and skipping even one layer leaves a chink in that armor. Now, on to some bullets, at least for the advanced considerations. If you're not already working with pharmacy, work with pharmacy. Make sure that you understand what updates are supposed to be on those pumps when you're servicing them. When you do the PM, I would encourage you, if you're not already doing this, to add to your PM task list something that says, make sure that I have the current software or the current pharmacy formulary on those infusion pumps. If they're wirelessly connected, don't assume that it is. Make sure that you actually have it on there. Just good practice, but it also prevents, hopefully, a and I'm not trying to be funny necessarily here, but it came to mind as far as a pun, the downstream effects of not having the right formulary in could deliver the wrong dose to a patient. Now, recall and advisory management, before you do PMs, at least before you do PMs, check and make sure that you don't have a recall. We've seen, and I've seen this before even joining ECRI, but we see and hear a lot about infusion pump recalls. They're not perceived as a real complex device by folks outside, but as we know, hopefully in this room, we know that the mechanical devices and the software sometimes have more problems, and these are also heavy use items, than say your more software only driven devices. So stay ahead of your recall and advisory services. If you're going one step further, for those of you in the room that have acquired used pumps, right? Or you're acquiring a new, you're merging, like is commonly going on right now, and you're merging and you don't know the history of how a recall was handled on a device, or even if it was subject to a recall or advisory, please, please, please consider in your policies or your procedures and in your practice onboarding that as if you don't know anything about it, and verifying either with the manufacturer, if they're still around for that matter, but with the manufacturer or in some other way that your pumps are current, right? I can't emphasize that enough. And my experience has been working in-house through mergers and acquisitions. We acquire stuff that we in biomed or HTM, we don't really know what the histories are. And it's a good area to look at. And then I've also worked for third party, and I can tell you that third party, it's kind of the same thing. You really don't know what you don't know until you either dig into the histories or you look at the device and say it doesn't meet the current requirements or the current expectations. Now, advanced considerations, alternate equipment maintenance. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I could, but it's better armor. Remember, preventative maintenance is armor, but an AEM is usually, and hopefully if you're using an AEM strategy or plan to use an AEM strategy, it's actually better. Technically, CMS only requires it to be equivalent to the OEM, but think about this. A knight could get their armor from the standard blacksmith. We'll call that the OEM. If they have some of that armor reforged, if you will, by a better blacksmith, that's where it comes into play that an AEM could improve that armor around your device, your organization, and you as an individual servicing that. And then something that isn't as prevalent as when I started, at least in some organizations that I've noticed, is collaborating with our end users and helping with their education, right? Not only helping with their education, but going to their in-services for that matter. Consider this as part of an advanced consideration, mainly because it doesn't seem to happen as often as it probably should, but understanding, as we hopefully all know in this room, understanding the clinical applications and the clinical frustrations that your customer has might help you improve on your maintenance practices and your delivery. A good example of this is something that I brought up yesterday on ventilator maintenance. If you understand in a pediatric environment that more patients are likely to be on ventilators during RSV season than any other time of the year, it's probably best to try and schedule your PMs when the census or the use on that equipment is lower. Now, you may not be able to do that with infusion pumps, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, if you've got some, about how you have anticipated, let's say, census changes, or for that matter, how you've anticipated better use of your time and the end user's time with equipment maintenance. Does anybody have anything to add?
Anybody like to speak? Doesn't look like it.
Well, I'm going to throw something out there just as kind of inspiration. I mean, I would assume that some of you are mobile when you do your infusion pumps. You might have a device from one of the test equipment manufacturers that allows you to go around on a cart or to travel and then set up on site. Maybe it's in your distribution area, maybe it's up on the floor. Does anybody have something like that going on?
Ooh, I've got a hand. Here you go.
Okay.
Hi, yes, my name is Robert, and I work as a tech at Yale New Haven Hospital. So we actually have I'm doing the PMs for our Baxter infusion pumps now, and we're using the Pronk FlowTrax technology to do it. Though I'm not actually going to the hospital at the moment. That could happen if some of the pumps are in hard to reach locations. I'm actually doing it in our workshop. But yes, I'm currently using one of those technologies.
Good. And I have I am not advocating for one piece or another. I've seen some interesting stuff from at least 2 other vendors, but I have personally used the Pronk in a field service role, and it's pretty handy, right? It requires very little setup, and it's very
Yeah, absolutely.
mobile.
I mean, it's great. There's no comparison. I am a huge fan of it. I mean, I'm aware of the Baxter method and what's written in the manual, and you know, but the Pronk is much quicker and much faster, and it's incredibly reliable, and it's more accurate. And yeah, I mean, if it does come to having to be mobile, then that is certainly a huge benefit in a hospital setting, because there's many areas where I certainly can't run a PM on a handful of pumps sitting there half hour, an hour just to collect some water. So it's or some fluid, but it's yeah, it's very useful.
Good. Thank you, Robert. It was Robert, right?
Yes, it is, Robert.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Nope. You are
Okay.
good to resume.
So moving on, this is a true story from the front lines. I was involved in this actually. A pump stops delivering medication, but no alarms go off. You know, nursing kind of feels that there's a problem. I felt like there was a problem when hearing this story. I didn't know where the problem was, but I asked the whys and the hows. But you get I get a feeling that something's wrong, but nothing indicated this issue. So what I found here was there was a software glitch. And again, this goes back to that recall advisory and stuff. I'm giving you some tips of things that I wish I had thought about before I went up on the floor, or before I accepted pumps and did PMs, or a PM post a repair. But a software glitch that the manufacturer had identified caused the flow rate to drop, just to drop completely without triggering an alarm. So I reprogrammed the software, recalibrated the flow sensors, and ran preventative maintenance on the alarm system, just to make sure that the alarm system itself wasn't a problem. So I mentioned at least one of the lessons, and I should have written this down as one of the lessons learned, is going back to this, is understand what recalls or advisories affect your fleet. But make sure that you go these other steps further and make sure that you're updating, you're using the diagnostic tools if they are available, either from the OEM or maybe a test equipment manufacturer. And in this case, I wish I could say this, it was good, there wasn't patient harm, necessarily, but don't ignore the instinct that something's off. In this case, it went a little longer than it should have, probably, because the nurse reported that she didn't think it was working a while before we found out that it really wasn't working. Does that make sense? So I'm going to move on. This is just one kind of example. Does anybody have any, gut checks, gut feeling checks where they knew something wasn't right?
Anybody?
And they decided to investigate.
Anybody? Nope.
Okay, it's a safe space, folks, especially I can't see you. I don't know. I know Robert's name now, so I'm going to probably follow it up with Yale New Haven.
Hi, it's
So-
Robert again. I don't really have any
Oh.
gut checks. Well, I just feel, at least, I mean, I've done large numbers of pumps. I don't really have any gut checks because I don't, it's an inanimate object. I want to approach every pump with the thought that, this pump is just to be as unbiased as possible. So I just will run the tests and I will, just see how it interacts. I mean, obviously, if I'm getting inaccurate readings for some reason, if I feel there's something wrong with the flow rate, if I see that perhaps some of the alarms are going off incorrectly, they're taking too long to trigger, or something might alert me then. But I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say anything my gut's more reacting as how the pump is actually operating in its space. But I do see something is off or something that's taking too long or not right, then I would investigate further.
Good, good. And actually, you just kind of reminded me of something that I should probably tell this audience. Gut checks aren't always a good thing, right? To make an assumption before you check it out, as Robert said, and evaluate the technical aspects of the pump, you can rule in or you can rule out a lot of things with the technical aspects, but to use a gut check in a bad way, like saying, well, it must have been an operator error, be very, very careful. It's political, of course, but be very careful about creating or instilling a culture where the assumption is it was somebody else's fault. And that can be a bad use of the gut check. I can tell you that one of my pet peeves over my history is EVS seems to get a lot of blame for something that happened in the middle of the night, right? Or something that looks like it happened. Something's not working, or something broke or whatever. And how could it be anybody else? Could it be a visitor? Could it be somebody else? But it doesn't get reported. And then it's automatically, I've seen it too many times, obviously. It's EVS's fault. In biomed, I think sometimes we jump to some conclusions and say, well, it's operator error. Certainly that can be the case, but I like to think of it as a use error because there might be a device issue, like the buttons aren't clear, for example, and it may be somebody did something that they should have known better about, right? There's somewhere in between. Thank you, Robert. So if you're familiar with Monty Python, there's this castle arc. Anyway, troubleshooting techniques, besting the black night of downtime. The reason you want to do effective maintenance, the number one reason is so that you don't have fires to put out. You don't have to address an issue that might have occurred with a patient that causes concern about their care. So flow rate errors, they're easily conquered with the right tools. And we'll go over a little bit of those as well. Occlusion detection, make sure there weren't any blockages. Sometimes it's a matter of looking at the set and the environment. If it's pinched in a bed rail, it's likely going to cause an occlusion, or it was the likely cause. Alarms. If you haven't heard of alarm fatigue, I'm sure we're all a little bit fatigued from alarms. But consider that somebody who says that they didn't know there was an issue with an infusion pump may not have heard the alarm because every other infusion pump on that floor was going off with, we'll call it nuisance reminders. And sensor calibration. When we are doing PMs, if it's PM worthy, right? And again, that's up for debate sometimes about different technologies. But let's assume that your infusion pumps that you're in your fleet are worthy of some sort of preventative or planned maintenance. Make sure that your sensors are tested, your flow rates are tested, your occlusions are tested, and your alarms for that matter. I kind of jumped around on this, but your sensors, make sure that they actually work. It's not a good assumption to say, well, 9 out of 10 passed. This 10th one, I can do something else with my time, like fill out the paperwork and not pay attention to the results of our test devices or our graduated cylinders or whatever. So preventative maintenance, and I kind of gave this precursor. Regular schedules. Now I say regular schedules, I can't think of a manufacturer out there that does not, if they prescribe a PM, does not have it on some sort of regular basis, annual, usually is been my experience. An AEM could throw that out the window. You could be looking at your pharmacy software for that matter and seeing how often a pump is used. You could be doing something else. But regularly schedule your PMs to disarm things before they become a problem. Detect things early. Your PMs will do some of that, but again, I'm going to go back to, if you don't have access to the tools, or if you don't somebody right now accessing these tools, if you have pharmacy software, there's usually a maintenance component to it or some things you can pull from it. And if they're connected wirelessly, you're going to be able to see some things going on that even not the patients, but the nursing staff, they aren't aware of it. And these small little issues, they can be killers. Hopefully not literally, but they can be killers before they, as they evolve to larger issues.
Is your microphone by chance plugged in? It's getting a little spotty. I'm not sure if it sounds kind of just like a bad connection.
It is not plugged in. It's a wireless one. So I'm wondering if maybe is it better? I kind of moved it closer to my face.
Yes,
okay.
Whatever you did sounds a lot better.
Okay, thanks for calling that out, Emily.
Of course.
So component replacements, not just say your batteries or whatever, swap out the worn parts before they start to revolt, right? You don't want the peasants revolting. You want to maintain this equipment before it becomes a downstream effect on your patients or your time. If you spend a little time on preventative maintenance, it's a lot more manageable than getting a call or seeing an influx of say, infusion pumps because you didn't have the best maintenance practices or you weren't as detailed as maybe you should have been. And then detail your documentation. I say this with a grain of salt. Many organizations will take the road of, if the manufacturer says simply check off a box that says passed for the overall PM or report that it was passed, then that's sufficient. I will tell you that personally, I think that before you move to an AEM strategy, it's important to document what the manufacturer recommends you document and not document anything else on the preventative maintenance. On a repair, make sure that you are documenting something that clearly reminds you and communicates to other people what the real problem was and what your resolution was. And the reason I say the real problem is if you have those love letters like I've had over my career from our clinical friends, usually those love letters almost always say broke. I have in the last year had one customer of mine give me such great detail that I went to the chief nursing officer and said, this nurse deserves to be put up on a pedestal. She needs to be an example for other nursing staff because she gave me such great detail about a problem they were experiencing in surgery with an electrosurgical device. But typically, I don't know about you all, but typically I've seen that broke, not broken, but broke is about as good as you get, and then you might get a little bit more. So these are my top 10. We're going to talk about what needs to change here, but these are my top 10. And you can read the slide. I'm going to go through this in a shortened version, give you the top 10, because this will be published, I think, in about a week or two after the presentation, so you can pull this down and you can tweak it. I'd definitely appreciate your feedback on this to say, how would you change this top 10? Battery health. I've already mentioned this, but if your battery isn't sufficiently operating up to or meeting the manufacturer's expectations, it's time to replace that battery. It's going to save you a lot of problems. It's going to save the nursing staff a lot of problems from trying to go get another pump or trying to find an outlet to plug things into when it's not ideal. Sensor calibration, I already mentioned this, but make sure that you calibrate those pressure sensors, those flow sensors, the detectors for whether or not there's the optical detectors, typically for fluids. Test your alarms, make sure they actually alarm. Fortunately, in the case that I brought up to you, we had tested the alarms. That had been proven to work, at least during the time that we did the preventative maintenance. But as I mentioned, we still retested the alarms to make sure that those alarm conditions would have been enunciated, just as an assurance, because we know that sometimes things go out of the shop and then they fail. Make sure that you're up to date on your firmware and software. Use OEM calibration equipment. Now, I'm glad Robert mentioned this, the Baxter pumps. Baxter is not the only one that has a recommendation to use a scale, right? And deionized or distilled water, that's deionized, I believe. For specific gravity, if you find a solution like the Pronk FlowTrax that is just as accurate for your needs, then do that. I do mention use OEM calibration equipment only because there might be some very specific tools that are hard to source from another area. And if any of you are familiar with the Smiths or now ICU Medical Medfusion series pumps, there are those barrels, the syringe-sized barrels and the length barrels that I don't know if it would be worth trying to have somebody mill those. Just probably buy them through whoever you buy parts or test equipment from, the manufacturer, or maybe like a part source or whatever. Inspect your power connections. I said power supplies, yes, but your power connections, oftentimes these infusion pumps, the worst little problem is the one at the back. Not that it's plugged into the wall, but that power cord is not the right fit. Make sure that you're fitting the right power cord into the right device. If it has a retainer or a holder, but make sure that it's snugly fit and it's not getting loose, because it can then cause problems, which then affect your battery, right? You'll run on battery, they won't know it necessarily, and then it will cause problems. Perform the full system PM, right? I mentioned alternate equipment management or maintenance. Certainly, once you have enough information, either from your hospital, if it's your hospital systems policy to only use your data, or from other bodies that have credible information as well, if your hospital policy allows for that, then move to an AEM and make sure that you're tracking how well that AEM performs in comparison to what the expectation from the manufacturers would have been. But perform full system PMs, however you have your program set up, if you're doing an AEM or you're doing an OEM only strategy. I cannot emphasize that enough, that performing those full system PMs and improving on them is going to be one of your best time savers, right? We all probably have experienced those crazy moments when it seems like we're flooded with pumps. It's PM months. It's times when we put out the call and we said we're still missing these pumps, and suddenly they show up at 3:30 p.m. in the afternoon with 20 pumps that they absolutely need turned around the next day or that evening. But if you do the full system PM, if you take the time to do the full system PM, you are more likely to not see that pump again until its periodic maintenance is scheduled. Log all your service events. That goes back to the documentation. If your software for your test equipment or your infusion pump or both record some information, determine whether or not that information is valuable to put into your CMMS, right? Some of these systems will integrate right with your CMMS, or they'll do it through some sort of application. But again, don't put things in your CMS that are not beneficial. And a good example of this, in my opinion, is electrical safety testing results. Now, it could be debated that it's good and it does some CYA for you, or it looks good to your customers to put electrical safety values in a report about what you did. It's nice, but I don't know of any clinical engineer, and I have never myself been interested in doing this, is to do an actual study or analyze the results year over year about the electrical safety. Because as we know, you could test it 1 year and it could have a slightly higher value than the next year and you've changed nothing. There's no value in documenting those results because you're not going to really analyze the trends. That's my opinion, at least. Simulate patient loads. Make sure that when you are looking at devices, especially those that are questionable, right? Somebody's had a question about it. You may want to have more of an approximation about what they were running. And this goes for pretty much any device, right? Simulate the patient, right? Or the conditions and see if you can get it to fail or find the root cause of a problem or rule out the problem. And then collaborate with IT if IT is managing, say, your network or applications and pharmacy on those recalls. Again, I'd love to hear your feedback on this. This is the kind of the short list, if you will. I shouldn't say short list. This is just a list without all the verbiage. Now, there are some advanced things that I think I wanted to share with you. Is there a comment, Emily? Oh, no. Okay.
It was turning on. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. There was not. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. Sounds good. So flow rate inconsistencies, number one thing to check is first of all, check that the flow rate inconsistencies that are being reported actually exist, and then recalibrate, right? I will tell you that you don't want to go ahead and recalibrate without understanding what the actual problem was for a variety of reasons. But the main reason why is it's a waste of time. I can't say this enough. Don't waste your time by calibrating something that you don't know was actually off to begin with, unless it's part of your maintenance plan. You know that it typically drifts or whatever. But when I say flow rate inconsistencies, I mean those things that are reported to you or that you observe during routine maintenance or an investigation on to, let's say, non-scheduled maintenance. The same thing goes with occlusion detection, but I will add this, is that although there are some good products out there and I rely on them for routine things, a good old-fashioned manual manometer that either is protected from fluid or can accept fluid is a good standard to have in your organization to make sure that your occlusion thresholds are at the right sensitivity. And on this, I really should have added this, and I think I may have in another slide, but on this, on your occlusion detections and your flow rates, et cetera, but not only checking your pharmacy library, but making sure that your pump, if it's a separate batch of settings that can be internally changed, make sure your pump defaults are what your hospital has agreed upon, or your healthcare system or your clinic has agreed upon, not what the factory defaults are from the manufacturer. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to make a little note of that real quick because this is something I'll add to the top 10. When something comes back from the manufacturer or from a third-party service provider, make sure you put your settings on that pump. They are very likely to have erased your settings as part of your acceptance before it goes back on the floors. Make sure that you put those things back on. Software glitches, identify and resolve the common bugs in pump firmware and better provided diagnostic tools. Alarm fatigue, can't emphasize that enough. It's a national patient safety goal, or it keeps coming back as a national patient safety goal, at least from the Joint Commission standpoint. And it's more true than that it causes a delay, at least, in somebody responding to the right alarms or even hearing the alarms, but delaying a response when somebody needs an actual response to a, let's call it an occlusion error versus a battery versus a end of drug delivery on schedule. And power failures. Diagnosis power failures, just check your battery, or you check your battery capacity and your connections. Connections first. This is not a troubleshooting class in the sense of check the easy things first, but check the easy, obvious things first. Make sure that your power cord is firmly planted, that the light comes on in front of the device, and then move on, right? You all probably have been around for a while, and if you haven't, I'm sure you have had a household experience where it's a matter of, is it plugged in? So, as knights of the round table of HTM, let's call it, BMETs, clinicians, and pharmacy need to sit at the same table, right? It may not always be the same case in every hospital, but make yourself an integral part of those decisions where you add to that value. Certainly, most BMETs cannot and do not provide treatment to a patient directly, but and I'm going to use Robert as a good example here, as Robert pointed out, evaluate and perform the technical services, kind of rephrasing of it, perform the technical services that you've been employed to, or you have people that work with you that have been employed to do. Now, it's not, I don't believe that's the only line necessarily, but avoid the risk of doing somebody else's job, help them, right? It goes back to maybe some of the education initiatives or observations. If you see somebody using something in a way that could be used better or is an inappropriate use, it's time to ask the question about how do you prevent that failure from becoming, in this case, a downstream effect to the patient. Use a little teamwork in your troubleshooting. This not only goes back to the documentation moment that I mentioned to you, is, document everything so that somebody else has the details. But if you work either in a field organization like I have, where you're the lone person in a region, or you work in a hospital with a lot of other technicians, there are ways to communicate with them and say, hey, I've been seeing this problem, right? Or I have this particular problem. Anybody else seen it? But make sure that you're working not only within the HTM or biomed department, but make sure that you're working with, say, pharmacy and with the clinicians. They may have problems that they've seen too, and they may already have workarounds, hopefully not too many workarounds, but they may have solutions. Okay, I mentioned training and support already, but make sure that you're helping with the education about the intended use and the proper use of that technology, and share those victory labs, so to speak, with your institution. Today, I had the privilege of joining a town hall with ECRI, and we had one of our board members speak to why he wanted to become and has been recently appointed to the board. And I didn't think I was going to bring up anything like this, but because it made such an impact, I'll bring up basically his statement. The reason he wanted to join ECRI, at least as an advisor, is because he had been a customer of their services for a while. I'm not trying to sell anything. I don't make anything off of sales, but I will tell you that what he said meant more than I've been a customer. He said at a time when his institution was blaming users about the use of infusion pumps and didn't take credence into the users and the biomed team saying there's something wrong, right, with these systems. They eventually leveraged enough resources and know-how to get the manufacturers to admit that they were hearing the same sort of concerns about that particular infusion pump technology. And that eventually resulted in that manufacturer taking that particular make and market. Initially,
Can you hear me?
sorry, go ahead. Yes. Yep.
Your microphone's doing it again. I apologize.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's going on there. Is this any better?
Yes. Whatever you did.
Okay.
Sounds good again.
Maybe I just need to, I'm so sorry to everybody about that. Anyway.
Oh, no worries.
Okay, some final thoughts before we take a few moments to discuss anything that you would like to discuss. Is mastering maintenance is really about mastering the basics and then going to those advanced steps. Again, this presentation will be available, and I want to hear your feedback so that it can kind of be refined, right? As a community, we seem to do better collaborating than just one person or a couple of people giving their thoughts. does involve regular calibrations, software updates, preventative maintenance to lead to, well, hopefully flawless performance. Troubleshooting with precision. Quickly identify, go for the easy stuff first and solve the problems, right? Collaboration with other BMETs, with clinicians and pharmacists, create a reliable environment and a reliable use of equipment in a healthcare setting. So make sure that you understand what your clinicians need. If you have an oncology section, for example, in your healthcare organization, and you have not sat down with them and said, how do you deliver therapies? It is not the same way. It is typically, at least, I've seen it a couple of different ways, but it's typically not the same way that your ICU is using infusion pumps, nor is it the same way, of course, that your anesthesia department is using infusion pumps in the OR setting. And then continuously learn. Things like MD Expo are wonderful. If you haven't already done this, do what I've done sometimes when I've been on the road or I've not been able to attend the Wednesday webinars. Go and pull up the older webinars, watch them, listen to them, get something new as a takeaway from those webinars. I can tell you that it's been very, very valuable, and I don't do it, even though I am a CVET, I don't do it for the renewal points. I do it because I learn something new every day. And I hope you have too. I'm going to open this up for any questions or concerns or comments that you have.